Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of the segmented bowl tutorial. In part 1, which is linked in the description below, the card up above, and the segmented bowl playlist, we talked about cutting our segments and building the rings. So now that we've got all that done, in part 2 we're going to talk about getting these rings flat, because as you can see with our bowl stacked up right now, we've got some pretty big gaps. So we're going to talk about some different techniques for flattening these so they sit nice and flush. If you have a drum sander or access to one, that is your best option. Go ahead and just use that and you can completely skip this tutorial. But if you're like me and a lot of other people where either you don't have one because of space or cost, then we're going to show you a couple of the different ways I flatten my rings and get them ready for clamping. So my preferred method of flattening my rings is actually to use my planer. And a lot like cutting segments with a miter saw, a lot of people online are going to say that you can't do that, you're going to damage your rings, so on and so forth. Well, it is a fairly aggressive technique and there is always the potential of damage, but we're going to go over some of the different tips and techniques that are going to minimize all of that. And at the end of the day, I like using this method because it's a lot quicker, a lot cleaner, and it gives us two parallel surfaces, which is going to be important. Now, if you don't have a planer, stay tuned for the second part of this video, and we're going to talk about using a homemade sanding disc, which is something everyone at home can do. Now, I think what is key for making this successful is to make sure that as your rings go through, they stay stable. So as a rule of thumb, anything that's less than about 6 inches, I won't send through here. It just does not have the surface area or the footing to stay stable as it goes through. And if we're not stable when we go through, as the rollers will grab it, it will kind of kick around and we've got the potential for it to kick up into the cutter, which as soon as that hits like that and tries to take a huge chunk out, it's just gonna explode our ring and go everywhere. So, like I said, anything small like that, I try not to send through. Now, say you're making a vase or you have like a bunch of small segments for the bottom of your bowl. What I've done in the past is just glued 2 of these points together like this in a figure 8 and sent it through like that. So that way you have the mass of going through and it will stay stable. Another thing I don't like to do is thin rings. Anything less than 1/4 inch, even though it might have that footprint, it just does not have the mass to stay stable. So anything like thin, like an accent ring, we'll go ahead and do the second technique. Now, other than ring stability, another thing I won't send through here is woods that like to splinter out. There's certain woods like Pt2 and honey locust, as they go through here, doesn't matter the size or the mass of it, they just do not cut well. And that's when they start to splinter out, your ends will blow out, and you really have the potential to damage them. So rings like that, I also go ahead and do on a sanding disc. So we talked about stability being extremely important, and that really comes into play on our first couple of cuts. So we want to make sure that this goes through smoothly. And as you can see, on this side of the ring, we have hardly any rock in it. Now if we flip this over, you can see that it's really not level. So that means we want to send the smoothest side through first. If you have one that's really out, you could go ahead and just hit this with some sandpaper and get it nice and smooth. So now that we've decided which side's going to go through first, we're going to just make extremely light cuts. And what I like to do is just clean up this side, and then we'll flip it over now that we have a new smooth side and go ahead and clean up the back. And this is probably going to take about 10 to 20 passes just to get this ring smooth. So now you can see on our first pass, we just hardly kissed it, which is what we want, because we really do not want to take aggressive cuts. So we're just going to go down a little more and repeat this until this is mostly clean, and then we'll go ahead and flip it. our glue marks are gone and we have a really nice flush side on this side. So we're gonna go ahead and flip it and start working on this side now that we have an extremely flat model. So while I go ahead and run our rings through the planer, let's go ahead and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both these techniques. So a planer obviously has some cost associated with it and takes up a lot of space, where the disc sander we're going to talk about, you can easily build this at home and it is not very expensive to do. One of the advantages of the planer though, like we talked about, you get two parallel sides, and we'll talk about why you don't get that when it comes to the disc sander when we get to it. An advantage of a disc sander is it is non-aggressive like the planer. You really don't run the risk of blowing out any rings. The advantage of a planer is the speed. Obviously we can run these rings through pretty fast and it does a nice job, where the disc sander we're going to be standing there a while. A disadvantage for the planer is the size in which the rings we can run them through. Obviously we can't run anything bigger than our planer through the planer, so for me anything that's about 12.5 inches or above I have to use a disc sander. And as well as any rings that are thin, we don't want to run those through. So that is one advantage of the disc sander, is the size in which we can flatten on it. But another huge advantage to the planer is the mess that it makes. It is a very clean process, unlike the disc sander that you're gonna see. So now that we've got both sides flattened, we don't see any glue or any indents, what I like to do is just go ahead and not adjust my cutter, but just give it a quick little spring pass. So there we go, in little time at all, and without making a huge mess, we have one of our rings done already, and we've got two smooth parallel surfaces. The only little bit of damage we got out of all of that is this little corner here had some tear out, which is not a big deal at all. As we stack our bowl, we'll just put that side down because our outside corners are going to get turned away anyway. So I do not have hardly any issues with planer snipe on this. If you did, you could easily just put a board on this side and a board on this side and run it through like that. All your snipe will be off of the ring and this will be perfectly parallel like it is now. So this technique does have some downsides besides it being aggressive. With my machine, I am limited to 13 inches, which is 3 inches smaller than what my lathe can handle. So when I make bigger bowls that are pretty much maxing out the lathe, I have to use the technique that we're about to talk about now. Okay, so say you don't have a planer or you're just not comfortable using it. You can go ahead and easily make yourself a sanding disc that'll mount right to your lathe. So what I've done here is I've got a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, cut a circle out of it, and then mounted a faceplate to the back. And now on the front side, we've just got a piece of glue and stick sandpaper on here. I like to do a fairly low grit. I think this is probably 80 or 120. That way you're not just sitting there trying to sand all day. Another really good thing you can do for this, if you go to a place that rents out like the floor sanding machines, you can buy a disc. It's probably going to be way too big, but you can easily cut it down, and that already has the adhesive on the back. So like I said, really easy to make this, hardly any money into this. So like I said, this technique is great for if you don't have a planer or you have rings too big for your planer, because you can basically make this the size of your lathe and you can do larger rings on it. Now, some of the reasons I don't like this technique is as you're pushing on this, you're really only putting force on where you're pushing. And especially with some of these thinner rings, they do tend to have some flex in them. So it's really kind of hard to get a perfectly two parallel surfaces. Another tendency is, say you have a part here that's just way sticking out more than the other side. You're gonna wanna be sitting there trying to push on that side to get that nice and flat. Well, that's again going to give you two non-parallel surfaces and almost like a wedge, which for the most part is not a huge deal. But if we go to put, say, a really thin accent ring on, when we go to trim the edge of our bowl, that ring might be really thick in one spot and really thin in the other spot, and it will show. The other reason I don't like this is that this is a huge mess. You can have a dust collector, but realistically you have 360 degrees that sanding dust is just flying everywhere. So you're gonna wanna make sure to be wearing a respirator and have a dust collector on if you have one, because this is gonna be a mess. Now, like I said, I use the planer technique, but if this is gonna be your go-to, you could always make yourself a fixture where it's basically another circle out of plywood and put some double-sided tape in a couple points, maybe even put some handles on it, so that way you're just pushing like this instead of getting in there with your hands, getting your fingers close to it. That way you're actually putting force around the whole circle and sanding it nice and evenly. But like I said, this is not what I normally use, so I'm not going to put any effort or time into that. So one last little tip I want to mention with a technique like this: say you have some wood that just, it sticks up a lot versus the one next to it, and this could just be because two different size woods, or we had a little issue gluing it up. But what you could do if you have a big enough set of coal jaws is you could mount this to the coal jaws and then just go ahead and face it off to where you're flush. And then I would still go ahead and hit that on the sander real quick, because even with the coal jaws, we kind of have a tendency to cut at an angle, and we don't want to try and glue things up like that. So I would just go ahead and real quickly clean that up. Even if you do cut perfectly, then you just verify everything's nice and flush. But we're just going to go ahead and sand these and go for it. Alright, so we just finished sanding our last ring. I'm going to go ahead and get everything cleaned up, and then when we come back we will move on to part 3 of the tutorial, where we take all the rings, clamp them up, and make a wood one. So if you enjoyed this and thought it was helpful, please feel free to leave a like or a comment, and if you want to see the rest of the tutorial, feel free to subscribe as well. Thanks for watching.